What would you do if the person you raised, the one you loved unconditionally, suddenly became your greatest fear? Imagine watching your own child transform in ways you never imagined, feeling powerless to stop it, and knowing that something dark was creeping closer every day, right under your roof. This is not a story of strangers or distant tragedies. This is a story of one of Hollywood's most admired filmmakers, a man whose career was marked by laughter, love, and cinematic brilliance, suddenly caught in the kind of nightmare no parent ever expects. Rob Reiner, the man behind timeless classics, the father, the husband, the friend, faced a terror so intimate, so unfathomable, that even his closest confidants were left speechless. And the revelation of that terror would come, unexpectedly, from one of Hollywood's most iconic figures, Clint Eastwood. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Clint Eastwood's voice trembled as he recounted what Rob had confided in him. The words were simple, yet devastating. "Clint," Rob had said, "I'm afraid of dying at my own son's hands." Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. A father fearing the person he raised to love him the most. A man who had devoted his life to nurturing and guiding his son now found himself walking on eggshells in the very home where he had once felt safest. And the man saying this was not some stranger or acquaintance. It was Rob Reiner, a pillar of strength, a figure the world admired for his composure, his intellect, and his unwavering dedication to family. But behind the public persona, behind the films and the accolades, there was a private life that few could penetrate. Rob Reiner's home in Brentwood, a sprawling estate worth millions, had become the stage for a tension that no one outside those walls fully understood. It was a house of contradictions, laughter and love on one side, fear and unease on the other. Friends and colleagues described Rob as warm, generous, larger than life, but they had no idea of the shadows that lurked behind closed doors. And when tragedy struck, the world would realize just how little they truly knew about the man they thought they understood. The night that Rob and his wife Michelle were found dead, the news shook Hollywood and the world alike. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office reported that both had died from multiple sharp force injuries. For a moment, disbelief reigned. How could this happen? Rob Reiner, the director of countless celebrated films, and Michelle, his partner of decades, who had built a life with him filled with love and family, were gone. And the alleged perpetrator? None other than their own son, Nick Reiner, living in the guest house on the same estate. The idea seemed unthinkable, yet the facts could not be ignored. It's tempting to stop here, to wonder how a family could unravel in such a horrific way. But the story demands we dig deeper. Because what makes this tragedy so confounding is not only the act itself, but the signs that preceded it. The subtle warnings, the moments of fear, the confessions Rob made to people he trusted. Clint Eastwood's tribute at the funeral would expose these truths in a way that left the world stunned. His voice broke as he revealed that Rob had no idea who his own son had become. "I gave him everything, but now I don't know who he is," Rob had said. Those words were not just a lament. They were a chilling prelude to what was to come. To understand the full gravity of what happened, we must step back and examine the life of Rob Reiner, the career that made him a household name, the family life that appeared flawless, and the private struggles that were carefully hidden. We must explore the complex relationship between Rob and Nick, the tensions simmering beneath the surface, and the moments that might have offered warning had anyone been able to see them clearly. This story is not just about murder. It is about trust betrayed, love twisted into fear, and the collapse of a family that once seemed untouchable. Imagine for a moment walking through the Brentwood estate in the days before the tragedy. The manicured lawns, the pristine interiors, the sense of calm and security, all masking a reality that few could comprehend. Friends of the family recall small, seemingly insignificant moments. A conversation that ended abruptly, a text message left unanswered, a look of confusion or fear in Rob's eyes. These fragments, scattered across time, would later be pieced together by investigators, revealing a pattern that suggested a man struggling with a knowledge that something was irreversibly wrong, but unable to act decisively. And as we peel back the layers, we will see just how carefully Rob tried to protect his family, and how cruel fate intervened in ways no one anticipated. Clint Eastwood's revelation also brings another dimension into focus: the weight of secrets shared with friends, the burden of confiding fears that seem unbelievable even to those closest. When Rob told Clint about his fear of Nick, he was not seeking advice. He was sharing a truth too heavy to carry alone. And yet, even with that confession, the trajectory of events was terrifyingly clear in hindsight. Rob's instinct to confide, to seek counsel from a trusted friend, highlights the universal struggle of parents everywhere. How do you protect your child and yourself when the person you trust most becomes a source of danger? The introduction of Nick Reiner into this narrative is equally critical. To the public, Nick appeared as any other child of famous parents might: private, occasionally in the spotlight, but largely living under the protective shadow of his family. But appearances, as we know, can be deceiving. Behind the closed doors of the Brentwood estate, tensions had been escalating. Nick's behavior, reported by close acquaintances and later confirmed through investigative sources, had begun to unsettle Rob and Michelle. And as these tensions built, the family dynamic shifted in ways that would eventually lead to unimaginable consequences. One of the most shocking elements of this story is the sheer normalcy of life in the days leading up to the tragedy. Friends and neighbors describe routine dinners, casual conversations, and seemingly typical interactions between Rob, Michelle, and Nick. Yet, beneath this veneer of normality, there were moments of warning, subtle, perhaps, but significant. The contrast between the outwardly serene household and the inner turmoil is what makes the story both gripping and heartbreaking. How could anyone reconcile the vibrant, successful lives of Rob and Michelle with the horror that would soon unfold? As we move further into this story, it becomes clear that the tragedy is not just an isolated event. It is the culmination of complex relationships, hidden fears, and unspoken warnings. Clint Eastwood's tribute, delivered with raw emotion at the funeral, serves as a window into Rob Reiner's private world. Eastwood spoke not only of loss but of the confusion and heartbreak that Rob had carried silently. His words provide insight into a father's love and fear intertwined in ways that are difficult to comprehend, even for those who have experienced parental anxieties. The tribute also challenges us, as an audience, to consider the depth of human relationships and the sometimes invisible fractures that can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Throughout the course of this story, we will explore multiple facets of the Reiner family's life: their public achievements, their private struggles, and the psychological undercurrents that shaped their interactions. We will delve into the events of the night of the murders, examining minute-by-minute accounts, the responses of first responders, and the initial investigative steps that unraveled the horrifying truth. Along the way, we will ask questions that have no easy answers. How could a family so outwardly successful and admired experience such profound tragedy? What were the signs, if any, that could have predicted this outcome? And ultimately, how do we reconcile the legacy of a beloved figure with the devastating circumstances of his death? This introduction is only the beginning. It sets the stage for a narrative filled with suspense, emotional intensity, and shocking revelations. As we progress, we will uncover layers of complexity in the Reiner family's story, exploring each character's perspective, the pivotal events that shaped their lives, and the moments that led inexorably to the tragic climax. The story will challenge assumptions, provoke deep emotional responses, and keep the audience engaged from the first sentence to the last. And as the layers unfold, the audience will begin to understand the magnitude of the loss, the depth of the fear Rob Reiner carried, and the profound impact of Clint Eastwood's words during the funeral. What does it feel like to love someone so deeply, yet fear them at the same time? For most of us, that question is abstract, a philosophical puzzle. For Rob Reiner, it became painfully real. The man who brought laughter, insight, and humanity to millions through his films found himself trapped in a nightmare no director could script. He loved his son, Nick, more than anything. He had poured his heart, his energy, his guidance into raising him. And yet, somewhere along the way, the person Rob thought he knew best became someone he could barely recognize, someone he quietly, and terrifyingly, feared. Clint Eastwood was one of the few people Rob felt comfortable confiding in. Not because he wanted sympathy, but because he trusted Eastwood's judgment, his grounded perspective, and his calm in the face of chaos. And when he finally shared what haunted him, it was with the raw honesty of a man at the edge of despair. "Clint, I'm afraid of dying at my own son's hands," he said. Imagine hearing that from someone you admire, someone larger than life, someone whose entire persona radiates strength and intelligence. The words are jarring, even shocking. But it was the truth Rob carried silently for months, perhaps years, hidden behind his public smile, behind the laughter of a successful career, behind the veneer of a family who appeared perfect to the world. What led to this fear? The answer is not simple, and it begins with understanding the intricate, often invisible dynamics of the Reiner household. Rob and Michelle's marriage was strong, admired by friends and colleagues alike. Rob had built a career on understanding people, directing actors, telling stories, capturing the nuances of human emotion on film. Yet, at home, he faced a scenario far more complex than any script he had ever directed. His son, Nick, was a young man with his own desires, frustrations, and unspoken struggles. To outsiders, he appeared normal, even charming. But to Rob, subtle changes in behavior, sharp words, and moments of alarming detachment signaled that something was wrong. Think about that for a moment. A father who has dedicated decades to raising a child, sensing that the person he loves most is becoming someone unrecognizable. Rob had nurtured Nick with every resource at his disposal: education, emotional support, opportunities in life, guidance in navigating both fame and responsibility. And yet, he was confronted with a growing realization. Love alone could not solve what was happening behind closed doors. His fear was not born of paranoia. It was a measured concern grounded in observation, intuition, and perhaps a desperate hope that he was wrong. Rob's confessions to Clint Eastwood revealed more than just fear. They revealed heartbreak. "I gave him everything, but now I don't know who he is," Rob admitted. Pause and consider the depth of that statement. A father reflecting on all he has sacrificed, all the lessons he imparted, and all the love he shared, now facing a son who seems to have become a stranger. For anyone listening, it is a gut-wrenching admission. And for Eastwood, it was more than words. It was a cry for guidance, for understanding, and perhaps for an acknowledgement of the unbearable weight Rob carried. What's remarkable and terrifying is how common this fear is in a distorted form. Many parents experience moments of doubt about their children, question their choices, or worry about who their children might become. But in Rob's case, those worries escalated into something far more alarming: a genuine, visceral fear for his own safety. And he was not alone. Michelle, too, reportedly sensed the tension, though she tried to maintain normalcy, protect her family, and shield everyone from the growing storm. Imagine the emotional toll on a couple trying to navigate life, love, and family while confronting a threat from the very person they raised. Even the small details that friends and colleagues later recalled paint a picture of a family on edge. Rob's gestures, the subtle changes in routine, the moments of unease during conversations. All of these are pieces of a puzzle that only later revealed its full, horrifying image. For instance, neighbors reported hearing raised voices in the weeks before the tragedy, though they dismissed them as normal family disagreements. Close friends noticed Rob becoming more private, withdrawing at times, visibly tense after certain interactions. These signs, while subtle, were hints of a fear that had been quietly escalating. Imagine living in that house, in that environment, aware that your child, your own flesh and blood, might be capable of unimaginable acts. It is a scenario almost impossible to comprehend. And yet, Rob Reiner lived it every day. He moved carefully, observing, measuring, and hoping that interventions, conversations, or professional guidance might redirect a trajectory he could not fully control. He was a man who had directed ensembles of actors, orchestrated complex productions, and managed conflicts on set with grace. But nothing in his professional life prepared him for the internal chaos of his family. Clint Eastwood's tribute at Rob's funeral would later reveal the emotional weight Rob carried. Eastwood spoke of Rob's trust, his vulnerability, and his quiet despair. He didn't know who his son had become, Eastwood said. And for the world listening, it was a stark reminder. No amount of fame, success, or public adoration could shield someone from the fear and heartbreak of realizing that your child might turn against you. Eastwood's words also highlight a crucial human element in the story. The need for connection, for confiding fears, and for seeking guidance when facing situations that seem incomprehensible. But what about Nick Reiner? To fully understand Rob's fear, we must explore the layers of his son's life and behavior. Nick was not inherently evil, nor was he a one-dimensional villain. He was a young man navigating his own challenges, but for reasons still under investigation, those challenges manifested in dangerous and ultimately lethal ways. Rob's fear did not emerge overnight. It was the culmination of patterns, incidents, and behaviors that made him increasingly anxious. By the time he spoke to Clint, it was clear that Rob felt powerless, uncertain of how to intervene, and deeply concerned about what might happen if nothing changed. This chapter of Rob's life, the private fear he carried, is the foundation of the entire story. It is the emotional undercurrent that explains the unthinkable events that followed. Without understanding the depth of that fear, without recognizing the internal struggle of a father facing a threat from his own child, the tragedy risks being perceived as senseless. But when we see the quiet desperation in Rob's confessions, the heartbreak in his words to Clint Eastwood, and the subtle warnings friends and family later recalled, a picture emerges of a man confronting a nightmare hidden in plain sight. And yet, there was more lurking beneath the surface. More than even Rob could articulate. Small signs, seemingly trivial moments, hints of deeper psychological shifts in Nick, all contributed to the mounting tension. Rob's fear was rational, grounded, and painfully real. It was compounded by the impossibility of completely controlling a grown child's actions. It was intensified by the weight of fame and public scrutiny. And it was magnified by the love and commitment he had poured into a son who, tragically, would become the epicenter of a catastrophe. As the story unfolds, we will examine the specific incidents that contributed to Rob's growing fear, the interactions that heightened tension, and the moments that later investigators would point to as warning signs. We will hear from friends, neighbors, and colleagues who sensed unease but could not intervene. And we will explore how Rob and Michelle attempted to navigate a situation that was spiraling beyond their control, even as the horror of the impending tragedy loomed ever closer. The key takeaway from this chapter is simple, yet devastating. Fear within a family can be invisible, silent, and gradual, but its consequences can be catastrophic. Rob Reiner's fear was real. It was specific. It was deeply personal. And it set the stage for events that would shock Hollywood, the world, and everyone who believed in the Reiner family's public image of love, security, and normalcy. The Brentwood estate was the kind of home people imagine when they think of Hollywood opulence. Nestled on quiet, tree-lined streets, it boasted sprawling lawns, manicured gardens, and architecture that married modern elegance with classic sophistication. On the outside, it radiated success, security, and peace. Inside, for Rob and Michelle Reiner, it was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to unwind from the pressures of fame, to nurture their family, and to feel safe. But appearances can be deceiving. What seemed like serenity to the outside world hid a tension so palpable that it would later puzzle friends, neighbors, and investigators alike. Imagine walking through those gates on a seemingly ordinary Sunday. The driveway stretches wide, flanked by perfectly trimmed hedges. A stone path winds through vibrant flower beds. The house itself is imposing yet inviting, with tall windows that catch the California sun just right. Yet, inside those walls, silence had begun to replace the laughter, and unease had started to overshadow warmth. Rob and Michelle, despite their status and resources, could not escape the storm building within their own home. The estate also contained a guest house where Nick Reiner lived. This seemingly ordinary arrangement, a son residing on the same property as his parents, would soon become a critical element of the story. The proximity, which should have been comforting, created an invisible tension. Every creak of a floorboard, every late-night conversation, every shadow passing through the hallway became a reminder of Rob's growing unease. It's easy to overlook how much domestic space shapes emotional safety. For the Reiners, the very walls that should have been protective became silent witnesses to an unraveling family drama. The night of the tragedy was ordinary in the sense that nothing externally seemed amiss. But beneath that veneer, the estate was a pressure cooker. Friends and neighbors later recounted that in the weeks leading up to the murders, there were subtle changes. Perhaps it was Rob becoming more private, or Michelle moving with a quiet tension. Maybe it was Nick's own behavior. Unexplained absences, withdrawn moods, or sharp retorts that didn't match the young man's usual demeanor. Each of these small details, when examined in hindsight, formed a pattern that pointed to something far darker than anyone outside the walls could have imagined. Law enforcement officers arriving at the scene would later describe the estate as both ordinary and extraordinary, a luxurious residence that could easily mask a nightmare. There was no immediate chaos visible from the outside, no obvious signs that anything had gone horribly wrong. Yet, once inside, the reality became undeniable. Multiple sharp force injuries were discovered, leaving no question about the severity and horror of what had occurred. The contrast between the pristine, carefully curated exterior and the violence found inside created a chilling dissonance that stunned everyone involved. Neighbors would later describe the initial moments after the discovery. Some recalled police cars pulling up, their lights cutting through the calm evening air. Others remembered the sound of helicopters hovering overhead. The news spread rapidly, carried by whispers and social media updates. But no report could capture the intimate horror of the scene itself. The bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner, lives ended in a place meant to symbolize love and security. For the first responders, the shock was profound. Even with decades of experience in law enforcement, encountering violence in a home of such renown and apparent tranquility is a jarring experience. The layout of the estate would later become a crucial point in the investigation. Investigators meticulously mapped the home, noting the locations of the bedrooms, hallways, and common areas. Each room told a story. The guest house, the main house, even the outdoor spaces offered clues about the movements and interactions leading up to the tragedy. In true crime investigations, the physical space is never neutral. Every corner, every entryway, every window can hold vital information. For Rob and Michelle, the estate that should have been their fortress became a labyrinth of vulnerability, where safety and danger existed in terrifying proximity. As details emerged, the media began to speculate. Headlines described the scene with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Terms like Hollywood horror and tragic betrayal circulated quickly. But beyond the sensationalism, there was a more human story. A family torn apart in the very space where they had shared their lives, dreams, and memories. For friends, colleagues, and fans, the dissonance was impossible to reconcile. How could a household known for love, success, and laughter harbor such darkness? The investigators also focused on evidence of premeditation and intent. Entry points, the positions of the victims, and the locations of personal items were analyzed in painstaking detail. Each detail revealed something about the final moments of Rob and Michelle's lives. The guest house became a critical element in this analysis, as Nick's proximity to his parents' home and the control, or lack thereof, he exerted over his own actions would become central to understanding the unfolding narrative. But there were also mysteries. Why had no neighbors noticed anything unusual until it was too late? Why had friends sensed tension but dismissed it as ordinary familial discord? And how could a father so perceptive, so experienced in reading human behavior, not foresee the exact trajectory that would lead to this tragedy? These questions would haunt the investigation and the public alike. The estate itself would later serve as a backdrop for one of the most emotional moments in Hollywood history, Clint Eastwood's tribute. Standing in a place that had witnessed both joy and unimaginable sorrow, Eastwood spoke not only of loss, but of the quiet fears Rob had carried. His words gave the world a glimpse into the Reiners' private reality, a reality hidden behind walls of beauty and wealth. In that moment, the estate was no longer just a luxurious home. It became a symbol of the duality of life, where public appearances and private struggles coexist, often invisibly, until tragedy exposes the truth. And yet, even as investigators combed through every inch of the property, the human element remained elusive. The estate could tell a story, but it could not explain the motivations, the emotions, or the mental states of those involved. That required testimony, recollections, and confessions. It required understanding the fragile, tense dynamic that Rob had quietly navigated in the months leading up to his death. In hindsight, the Brentwood estate was more than just a location. It was a character in this tragedy. It shaped the events, constrained the actions, and framed the horror that unfolded. The estate's beauty and opulence made the violence even more shocking, while its structure and layout played a crucial role in the narrative of fear, tension, and ultimately, loss. To understand the Reiner story, we must see it through the lens of this estate, not merely as a house, but as a stage upon which a real-life drama, more horrifying than any script, would play out. Nick Reiner. To the world, he was the son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, a private figure in an otherwise public family. Outsiders might have pictured him as just another Hollywood offspring, protected, occasionally in the spotlight, navigating life under the shadow of his father's fame. Yet, appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, Nick's story was far more complicated, filled with contradictions, secrets, and behaviors that increasingly worried his parents. Imagine being raised in a household where the world admires your father as a genius director, your mother as a loving partner, and your family as the embodiment of Hollywood success. Expectations, both internal and external, would weigh heavily. Nick had every advantage: education, opportunities, guidance, love, but with those privileges came pressures invisible to the public eye. A child raised in such a household might feel gratitude, yes, but also confusion, resentment, or the need to define himself outside of the family narrative. And in Nick's case, those internal struggles manifested in ways that would ultimately shatter the very foundation his parents had worked so hard to build. Friends and acquaintances later described Nick as intelligent, charming, and at times, inscrutable. He could engage warmly in conversation, yet vanish into silence without explanation. Some noticed sudden shifts in his mood, subtle outbursts, or sharp retorts that seemed disproportionate. To many, these were simply quirks of personality. To Rob, they were warning signs, fragments of a larger puzzle that made him increasingly uneasy. Rob had raised his son to value empathy, responsibility, and honesty, and yet, he found himself questioning, who exactly was Nick becoming? This question was not abstract for Rob, it was existential. He had given everything to his son. Emotional support, guidance, opportunities, love. And now, as he confided to Clint Eastwood, he did not recognize the person who inhabited the same walls as him. Imagine that internal conflict, loving someone so deeply, yet fearing them, wondering when, if ever, that bond might be broken beyond repair. It is a struggle that many parents may face in subtle ways, but rarely with such extreme stakes. Nick's behavior had reportedly become increasingly erratic in the months leading up to the tragedy. Sources suggest that he withdrew from family interactions, resisted guidance, and displayed growing frustration. There were moments when his parents observed him observing them. Sharp eyes, tense posture, a quiet intensity that unnerved even the most experienced adults. And as these patterns intensified, Rob and Michelle began to feel the weight of a reality that was difficult to articulate to anyone else. Their own son might become a danger to them. The challenge for Rob was that the warning signs were nuanced. There was no single, dramatic event that screamed danger, only a series of subtle cues that collectively suggested an escalating risk. Parents facing this scenario must grapple with the impossible: how to intervene, when and how to confront, and when to involve external help without shattering trust or making matters worse. Rob and Michelle tried, in their own way, to manage these tensions, offering guidance, maintaining routines, and keeping lines of communication open, but they were facing a storm they could not control. It is also important to understand Nick in context. He was a young man of 32, navigating the pressures of adulthood and the added complexity of living in a household of privilege and expectation. Mental health challenges, unspoken frustrations, and personal struggles may have contributed to his behavior. While nothing excuses violence, Understanding the context of Nick's life is critical to comprehending the full tragedy. Often, the public only sees the headline, the shocking act itself, without recognizing the years of subtle tension, fear, and internal conflict that preceded it. Friends and family members later described interactions with Nick that, in retrospect, seemed like glimpses of something deeper. Small disputes, withdrawn behaviors, and moments of uncharacteristic anger all contributed to Rob and Michelle's growing unease. For them, the fear was cumulative, a slow-burning recognition that their son was no longer the person they thought they knew. And in the end, that fear would prove tragically prescient. Publicly, Nick remained largely invisible. He did not seek attention, he avoided the spotlight, and he kept much of his personal life private. This anonymity created a contrast with the tragedy that would later shock the world. The son of one of Hollywood's most beloved families, arrested for the murder of his own parents. To the public, the revelation was incomprehensible. How could someone so close, someone raised in a loving, affluent household, commit such an act? The truth, of course, is more complex. Nick's life, like many people's, was shaped by layers of expectation, emotion, and unspoken struggle. His parents' love, while profound, could not prevent the escalation of tension that had been building for years. Rob's confessions to Clint Eastwood hint at a deep parental anguish, the realization that sometimes, despite all efforts, the path a child takes may become unrecognizable and terrifying. Consider the psychological impact on Rob and Michelle as they navigated this uncertainty. They were dealing not only with public lives under scrutiny, but also with private fears that carried real, existential consequences. How do you love someone you are afraid of? How do you protect yourself without destroying the very bond that defines your relationship? These are questions few parents ever face in the extreme, and Rob's attempt to reconcile them underscores the intensity of his internal struggle. In hindsight, the pieces of the puzzle start to fit together, though tragically too late. The subtle behaviors, the withdrawn interactions, the unexplainable tension, all point to a dynamic that would culminate in disaster. Friends and neighbors might have missed it, the public certainly did, but inside the Reiner household, fear was growing, carefully hidden behind routine, politeness, and the illusion of normalcy. As investigators later pieced together the timeline, the guest house where Nick lived became central to understanding how proximity and domestic layout contributed to the tragedy. Every step, every interaction, every decision inside the estate took place against a backdrop of tension that was invisible to the outside world, yet palpable to those living within. It is a chilling reminder that danger is not always external. Sometimes, it exists where love is meant to thrive most. Nick Reiner, the son everyone thought they knew, was a puzzle even his parents could not fully solve. And that puzzle, misunderstood, unaddressed, and ultimately lethal, would leave a trail of devastation that the world would struggle to comprehend. It began like any other evening at the Brentwood estate. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across manicured lawns, and the warm glow from the windows of the Reiner home suggested comfort, safety, and routine. Friends and neighbors would later describe it as an ordinary night, quiet, unremarkable. But within those walls, something far from ordinary was unfolding, something so terrifying that it would forever scar everyone connected to the family and shake Hollywood to its core. Rob and Michelle had likely spent the evening in familiar ways, perhaps preparing dinner, discussing their day, or catching up on news and family matters. On the surface, it would have appeared as normal as any Sunday night. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Rob's private fears, the ones he had confided to Clint Eastwood, were not just idle thoughts. They were a gnawing reality, a silent dread that he carried like a shadow through the corridors of his own home. And as fate would have it, that shadow was about to become lethal. Nick Reiner's presence in the guest house was central to the unfolding drama. As a young man living in close proximity to his parents, he had daily access to their lives, their routines, their vulnerabilities. The very arrangement that might have seemed practical, a son residing nearby, became a conduit for escalating tension. Every noise, every movement, every moment carried weight. In the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy, small incidents had accumulated, terse exchanges, unexplained absences, moments of withdrawn behavior. On that night, these tensions reached a breaking point. According to investigative reports, the first signs of horror came not with noise or confrontation, but with a silence that was both eerie and foreboding. The type of silence that makes a person pause, senses sharpening, instincts on alert. First responders later described the scene as one of shocking duality. The house maintained its outward elegance and order, yet inside, the evidence of violence was unmistakable. Multiple sharp force injuries had claimed the lives of Rob and Michelle, leaving behind an incomprehensible tableau of domestic tragedy. It is impossible to overstate the emotional impact on those who arrived first. Law enforcement officers, paramedics, and forensic specialists had encountered crime before, but nothing quite like this. The juxtaposition of a luxurious Hollywood estate, a place synonymous with wealth, safety, and prestige, against the brutality that had occurred within it created a sense of cognitive dissonance that few could reconcile. One officer would later describe it as walking into a nightmare hidden behind a velvet curtain. From a forensic perspective, every detail mattered. The placement of the victims, the layout of the rooms, and the location of personal items provided critical insights into the final moments of Rob and Michelle's lives. Investigators meticulously mapped each space, noting entry points, possible sequences of events, and signs of struggle. The guest house, where Nick lived, was analyzed for access routes, potential points of confrontation, and evidence of premeditation. In a case where every detail could hold meaning, the estate itself became a silent witness to the tragedy. Friends and neighbors later described the immediate aftermath with a mix of disbelief and horror. Police cars lined the driveway, lights cutting through the calm night, and helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting the scene to a public eager for answers. The story spread rapidly across media outlets and social platforms, but no article or headline could capture the human terror of that night. A father and mother, lives ended violently, and the realization that the perpetrator was their own son. The psychological dimensions of the night are equally chilling. Imagine the mindset of a parent confronted with a child whose behavior has become increasingly unpredictable and threatening. Imagine the anticipation, the fear, and the impossible calculus of deciding whether to intervene or wait, whether to confront or protect. Rob Reiner had faced this in quiet moments, confiding in friends, seeking counsel, and navigating a path no parent wants to tread. On that night, those fears manifested in the most horrifying of ways. Even before the crime was discovered, the indicators of tension had accumulated. There were small, almost imperceptible signs: doors left slightly ajar, muted arguments, hurried movements, and a pervasive feeling of unease. To the casual observer, these may have seemed insignificant, even mundane. But for those attuned to the Reiner family's dynamics, they were ominous. By the time investigators arrived, the weight of those cumulative moments crystallized into a tragic reality that stunned even the most experienced responders. The role of the Brentwood estate itself cannot be underestimated. Its layout, its proximity, and its design inadvertently facilitated the events of that night. The guest house allowed access without confrontation. The main house contained private spaces where tension could simmer unseen, and the physical environment amplified the psychological dynamics at play. This is a critical point in understanding how tragedy unfolded. The setting was not neutral. It shaped actions, concealed intentions, and became a backdrop against which horror was enacted. Media coverage immediately latched onto the story, amplifying the shock and disbelief. Headlines screamed of Hollywood horror, betrayal, and unfathomable acts. Yet beneath the sensationalism, the human story, the fear, the tension, the private confessions, and the emotional struggles remained invisible to most readers. Clint Eastwood's tribute would later pierce this veil, offering the world a glimpse into the private fears Rob had carried and the emotional complexity that the media could never fully capture. As the night progressed, the chain of events leading to the discovery of the bodies remains a chilling reconstruction. Authorities later pieced together timelines, statements, and physical evidence to understand what occurred. Each step revealed layers of complexity, moments of hesitation, sudden escalation, and the horrifying realization of irreversible consequences. Every detail was analyzed to reconstruct the final hours of the Reiner family, and each revelation deepened the tragedy. For Rob and Michelle, the night was likely filled with fear, confusion, and perhaps desperate attempts to navigate an impossible situation. For Nick, it marked the culmination of tension, frustration, or motives that remained partly speculative but undeniably led to catastrophic action. The interplay of emotion, proximity, and psychological dynamics created a perfect storm, a scenario in which love, fear, and violence collided with devastating finality. Ultimately, the Night of Horror serves as the pivot point in the Reiner family's story. It transforms private fear into public tragedy, unites past warning signs with irreversible outcomes, and sets the stage for the legal, emotional, and societal fallout that would follow. The quiet, ordinary-looking estate became the scene of a crime that defied comprehension, challenging assumptions about family, safety, and the very nature of human relationships. When news of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths broke, Hollywood went silent. For a moment, the glitz, glamour, and relentless pace of the industry seemed to halt, replaced by an atmosphere of disbelief, grief, and profound confusion. The story was unfathomable. Two beloved figures, celebrated for decades, murdered in their own home, and the alleged perpetrator was none other than their son, Nick Reiner. The combination of fame, horror, and family betrayal sent shockwaves through Tinseltown and rippled far beyond the borders of California. Colleagues and friends of Rob Reiner immediately began processing the news, many struggling to reconcile the public persona with the private tragedy. Directors, actors, producers, and writers who had worked with him described Rob as warm, intelligent, and deeply empathetic, a man whose talent was matched only by his generosity. For those who had known him personally, the news was almost impossible to comprehend. He was a father first, a mentor second, and a friend to all of us, one longtime collaborator later reflected. To think that something like this could happen to him is just surreal. Among the most emotional responses came from Clint Eastwood, who had long been a close friend of Rob. At the funeral, Eastwood's tribute stunned attendees. His voice trembled as he recounted conversations with Rob, including the chilling confession that had haunted him. He told me he was afraid of dying at his own son's hands. The words left the audience in stunned silence. Even in a room accustomed to Hollywood theatrics and bravado, the raw human emotion was palpable. Eastwood's reflection went beyond public mourning. It offered a window into the private terror Rob had carried silently for months, a terror that the world could barely fathom. Other actors and filmmakers weighed in, offering condolences and attempting to make sense of the incomprehensible. Social media exploded with tributes, hashtags, and expressions of disbelief. Fans around the globe struggled with the paradox. Rob Reiner, the beloved filmmaker, the figure of cultural familiarity, had been taken in a manner so intimate and violent that it defied understanding. Celebrities shared personal anecdotes, emphasizing the Reiner's generosity, humor, and kindness. Yet behind each tribute lingered the unspoken horror, a family destroyed from within. The press, of course, seized on every detail. Early coverage focused on the shocking nature of the murder, the celebrity connection, and the inconceivable circumstances of the alleged perpetrator being the couple's own son. Headlines screamed of Hollywood horror and familial betrayal, drawing attention to the gruesome details without fully capturing the human complexity. Journalists speculated, analyzed, and debated motives. But even the most thorough coverage could not bridge the gap between factual reporting and the emotional truth that Rob and Michelle's loved ones felt. Yet beyond the cameras and flashing lights, there was a quieter, more profound response from those who truly knew Rob. Friends recounted small, intimate memories. The way he would counsel a struggling colleague, the gentle humor he used to ease tension on set, the care he took in mentoring young filmmakers. These stories painted a picture of a man whose public brilliance was only part of his story. The private fears he carried, the tension he endured within his own home, were invisible to all but the closest confidants. Eastwood's revelation, therefore, carried weight beyond mere shock value. It illuminated a hidden struggle that made the tragedy all the more poignant. Public mourning was also evident outside Hollywood circles. Fans sent letters, created online memorials, and shared messages on social media platforms expressing disbelief and sorrow. In communities around the world, people grappled with the incongruity. The Reiners, symbols of success and love, now reduced to a crime story with elements so unsettling it bordered on fiction. Psychologists, true crime analysts, and journalists speculated on the underlying causes, highlighting warning signs, family dynamics, and mental health considerations. Yet, even expert analysis could only scratch the surface of the emotional devastation that those closest to the family felt. Among the most fascinating aspects of Hollywood's response was the intersection of public persona and private tragedy. Rob Reiner's career was characterized by storytelling that explored human emotion, relationships, and moral dilemmas. Films like When Harry Met Sally and The Princess Bride captured joy, humor, and the complexities of love. In real life, however, Rob confronted dilemmas far darker than anything he had depicted on screen. Betrayal from within the family, fear of a loved one, and the ultimate collapse of domestic safety. Hollywood, accustomed to dramatizing tension for entertainment, now confronted a real-life story more chilling and tragic than any script. The narrative also sparked discussion about the pressures of fame, wealth, and parental expectation. Nick Reiner's upbringing in an environment of privilege and expectation may have contributed to the emotional complexities that ultimately led to tragedy. Colleagues of Rob and friends of the family reflected on the difficulty of balancing professional excellence with private family dynamics, a tension few could ever truly understand. In many ways, Hollywood itself became a mirror for the story, an industry built on appearances, narratives, and projection, confronted by a scenario where reality was incomprehensibly dark and devastating. Clint Eastwood's tribute, however, stood apart from the rest. Unlike media speculation or social commentary, Eastwood's words were grounded in direct, personal experience. He had seen the fear Rob carried, understood the nuances of his struggle, and bore witness to a father's ultimate vulnerability. In his speech, he emphasized not just the horror of the murders, but the heartbreak of realizing that parental love sometimes cannot prevent tragedy. It was a rare moment where celebrity, emotion, and truth converged, offering insight into a situation that otherwise seemed impossible to grasp. Yet even in Hollywood, a city accustomed to drama, gossip, and spectacle, the story challenged assumptions. How could such a respected and seemingly stable family harbor tension so extreme? How could a son, raised with privilege, guidance, and love, allegedly commit such an act? These questions dominated conversations, panels, and think pieces in the following days. Each analysis, each reflection, underscored the depth of shock. This was more than a crime story. It was a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust, family bonds, and human perception. Behind the glitz, however, grief remained profoundly human. Family members, close friends, and colleagues struggled to reconcile memories of warmth, humor, and love with the violent reality. The juxtaposition of public admiration and private horror created a tension that would define the narrative in the weeks, months, and years to come. Even as Hollywood mourned, the personal stories, the moments Rob and Michelle shared with friends, the guidance Rob offered young filmmakers, the generosity that marked his life, remained a testament to a life interrupted. And while public reaction was overwhelming, Clint Eastwood's tribute offered something deeper. Context, humanity, and a glimpse into the fears Rob had carried silently. He reminded everyone that tragedy does not occur in a vacuum. It is the culmination of private tensions, unspoken fears, and relationships strained to the breaking point. Rob's death, and the manner in which it occurred, was the manifestation of struggles that had long existed but remained largely invisible. To the world, Rob Reiner was a titan of Hollywood, an award-winning director, actor, producer, and cultural icon. He was known for films that captured the nuances of human emotion, blending humor, drama, and romance with an authenticity few filmmakers achieve. But behind the accolades and the public persona existed a man whose private life was far more complex, nuanced, and, in the weeks before his death, deeply fraught with fear, and uncertainty. Rob's career was built on storytelling that explored human relationships with precision and empathy. He directed timeless classics like This Is Spinal Tap, When Harry Met Sally, and The Princess Bride. He understood characters, what motivated them, what scared them, what made them human. He understood people, often better than they understood themselves. Yet, despite this expertise in reading human behavior, he found himself navigating one of the most confounding dynamics imaginable, the growing, unrecognizable behavior of his own son, Nick. Michelle, his wife, often described Rob as both warm and meticulous, a man who approached both his work and his family with thoughtfulness and care. Friends recall that Rob was deeply present in his children's lives, offering guidance, support, and unconditional love. He was the kind of parent who celebrated achievements, provided counsel in moments of struggle, and sought to instill values of integrity, empathy, and responsibility. Yet, as his private confessions to Clint Eastwood revealed, he also carried a fear he could hardly articulate, that despite all his efforts, he might not be able to protect himself or his family from someone he loved. Inside the Reiner household, Rob balanced multiple roles. He was a husband, a father, a public figure, and a friend to many. Each role carried its own set of expectations. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of success and composure. To his friends, he was a source of humor, insight, and counsel. To his family, he was both protector and guide. But beneath the surface, he navigated fears that few could imagine, tensions that few could see, and anxieties that no public appearance could reveal. Friends who knew him personally described moments that, in retrospect, were poignant indicators of his internal struggles. Small gestures, fleeting expressions of concern, and moments of withdrawal hinted at a man wrestling with private fears. Rob was careful not to burden others unnecessarily, yet confiding in someone like Clint Eastwood suggested the gravity of his concern. Sharing such a fear of being harmed by his own son, was not only a cry for understanding, but also a testament to the weight of the emotional burden he carried in silence. Rob's relationship with Nick had, for much of his life, been defined by love, guidance, and attention. He had provided everything he could: education, mentorship, exposure to the arts, and opportunities that many could only dream of. But love, as he came to realize, has limits when confronted with unpredictability, secrecy, and emotional volatility. The tragic reality was that Rob's ability to influence his son's choices had diminished, leaving him in a state of profound helplessness. A helplessness that is particularly wrenching for a parent. This private struggle existed in stark contrast to the public persona Rob maintained. In interviews, public appearances, and press events, he was confident, witty, and insightful. Colleagues often marveled at his ability to connect with people and extract authentic performances from actors. He understood psychology, motivation, and narrative arcs. Yet in his own home, he faced a situation that defied even his considerable understanding. A son whose behavior was increasingly alarming, whose intentions were opaque, and whose unpredictability carried the potential for catastrophic consequences. Michelle, too, played a pivotal role in maintaining a semblance of normalcy. Friends and family described her as compassionate, resilient, and devoted to her children. Yet she, like Rob, had to navigate the tension of protecting the family while managing the growing threat that emerged from within. Their partnership, which had been a source of strength for decades, became a vital line of defense against forces neither fully understood nor could control. Together, they attempted to manage, to guide, and to protect, even as the storm of domestic tension intensified. Rob's private life also reflected a man of values and principles. Despite immense success, he remained grounded, often prioritizing relationships over accolades, generosity over self-interest, and family over fame. He was a mentor, a friend, and an advocate for causes he believed in. These qualities underscore the tragedy of his death, a man who gave so much to the world, to his community, and to his family, ultimately meeting violence at the hands of the one person he loved unconditionally. For those who observed Rob's life closely, the tension in the weeks leading up to the tragedy was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. Friends noticed he was quieter, more introspective, occasionally distracted. He had confided some of his fears to Clint Eastwood, yet outwardly continued to maintain composure. This duality, public strength and private fear, illustrates the depth of the emotional complexity he navigated. It also highlights the cruel reality of his final months, that despite his experience, insight, and wisdom, he could not prevent the looming catastrophe. Rob Reiner's private life, therefore, is central to understanding the tragedy. It shows a man striving to protect and nurture, yet confronted by forces beyond his control. It illustrates the tension between public perception and private reality, between what is visible to the world and what is lived in silence. And it provides context for the chilling confession he made to Clint Eastwood, a fear that was deeply personal, profoundly rational, and tragically prophetic. The depth of Rob's humanity emerges most clearly in the juxtaposition of his life and death. He had built a world of connection, humor, and creativity. He had guided and loved his children. He had achieved professional acclaim while maintaining personal integrity. Yet, in the private corners of his home, he faced a danger no amount of talent, foresight, or love could fully mitigate. It is this contrast that makes the tragedy so stark, so heartbreaking, and so universally resonant. As the investigation unfolded and the world learned more about the Reiner family, it became increasingly clear that the private life Rob Reiner led, the quiet struggles, the confessions, the unspoken fears, was as critical to the story as the public persona he projected. Understanding this man, the father, the husband, the friend, is essential to comprehending how the tragedy could occur, how love and fear intertwined, and how the world's perception of Rob Reiner as a cultural icon intersects with the deeply human vulnerabilities he carried until his last moments. The morning after the tragedy, the Brentwood estate was transformed from a home of apparent luxury and comfort into a crime scene of unparalleled horror. Police tape cordoned off the property, detectives and forensic specialists moved with deliberate precision, and the quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the hum of investigation. The world watched in disbelief as news of Rob and Michelle Reiner's death spread, but inside the estate, the meticulous work of uncovering the truth had only just begun. The first step for investigators was securing the scene. Crime scene technicians documented every detail. The position of the bodies, the locations of personal items, the condition of doors and windows, and any signs of struggle. Every square foot of the home and guest house was examined for clues, as each could offer insight into the timeline of events and the actions of the perpetrator. In cases involving family members, proximity becomes a critical factor, and Nick's residence in the guest house immediately placed him at the center of suspicion. Detectives faced a challenge that few had encountered: the combination of celebrity, wealth, and domestic violence. While the property was visually spectacular, investigators had to move beyond appearances to reconstruct a narrative grounded in evidence. They examined fingerprints, DNA, and forensic traces, paying close attention to the sharp force injuries that had claimed the lives of Rob and Michelle. Each cut, each mark, each item displaced provided critical information about the dynamics of the attack. Interviewing witnesses became a central component of the investigation. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues were questioned, providing insights into the Reiners' public and private lives. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices in the weeks prior, but dismissed them as ordinary family disputes. Friends noticed subtle changes in Rob and Michelle's behavior: quiet tension, brief withdrawals, and moments of unease. These details, seemingly minor in isolation, collectively painted a picture of a family struggling behind a facade of normalcy. Nick Reiner quickly became the focus of law enforcement scrutiny. His access to the main house, his proximity to his parents, and his behavioral patterns made him a person of interest. Investigators sought to understand his movements, mindset, and potential motives, while also examining possible triggers that might have led to the catastrophic event. Every interaction, text message, and recorded communication was analyzed to reconstruct the chain of events leading to the murders. The investigation also revealed the complexity of domestic crime in affluent households. While resources may seem to offer protection, they can also mask tensions, and allow dangerous behaviors to remain hidden until tragedy strikes. The Brentwood estate, with its multiple entrances, private guest house, and expansive layout, provided both a sanctuary and a stage for conflict. Understanding the interplay between environment and behavior was essential for investigators piecing together what had occurred that fateful night. Forensic specialists focused heavily on the sharp force injuries that claimed Rob and Michelle's lives. Determining the sequence, force, and location of each injury was critical in reconstructing the timeline and nature of the attack. Patterns in the wounds suggested moments of struggle, hesitation, and violence, while the distribution and severity provided clues about the perpetrator's intent. In addition, investigators examined surrounding objects, household items, and potential weapons to establish a comprehensive understanding of the events. The investigation extended beyond physical evidence. Psychologists and behavioral analysts were brought in to assess the family dynamics and possible triggers for violence. Rob's prior confessions to Clint Eastwood, his documented concerns, and the reports of friends and neighbors became part of the analysis. These insights offered a rare glimpse into the emotional and psychological context in which the crime occurred, highlighting the invisible pressures and fears that had preceded the tragedy. Media scrutiny complicated the investigation. As information leaked, headlines speculated on motives, behavioral issues, and family tensions. Yet, for the investigators, public perception was secondary to facts. They had to separate rumor from evidence, narrative from reality, and emotion from action. Each step required methodical precision, as even minor errors could jeopardize the integrity of the case. The early days of the investigation revealed disturbing details about Nick's life leading up to the murders. Patterns of withdrawal, uncharacteristic behavior, and escalating tension were noted in statements from friends and family. Investigators sought to determine whether any interventions had been attempted, whether warning signs had been observed, and whether the tragic outcome could have been prevented. The complexity of human behavior, combined with the intimacy of family relationships, made every decision and action critically important to understanding the crime. As the forensic and investigative teams pieced together the puzzle, a broader narrative began to emerge. It was not merely a story of murder. It was a story of fear, love, and human limitation. Rob and Michelle Reiner, despite decades of wisdom, experience, and care, had faced circumstances they could neither predict